She thought she was just helping someone in need. Every day, without fail, she brought food to a homeless man on the corner. But what she didn't know was that this homeless man was hiding something unbelievable. He was a millionaire in disguise. What was he doing there? And why her? This heartwarming story will challenge your views on kindness, fate, and the hidden lives of strangers. Watch until the end for a twist that will leave you speechless. In the bustling city of Alderhaven, everything seemed to move at the speed of ambition. Cars lined the streets in never-ending streams. Horns served as punctuation in the city's chaotic language, and towering buildings of glass and steel reached into the heavens, as if trying to outdo one another in their cold magnificence. The people who walked these streets barely looked up, eyes glued to phones, feet trained on schedules, minds constantly somewhere else. In a city that never paused, Avery Langdon did. She was an unusual presence in a place like Alderhaven, not because of anything flashy or loud, but precisely the opposite. Avery had a softness about her, something that lingered in her posture, her voice, and especially in her eyes. She worked in a quiet, almost forgotten library tucked between a dry cleaner and an old clock repair shop on Brookmere Street. While the world outside rushed forward, the library remained a sanctuary of stillness. Every morning, Avery would arrive early, unlocking the heavy oak doors with a familiar creak. Inside, the scent of old paper and polish would wrap around her like a favorite sweater. She took comfort in the rhythm of her days, cataloging returns, setting up story-time circles for children, and chatting with elderly regulars who came not just for books, but for conversation and company. She knew their names, their reading preferences, their grandchildren's birthdays. But it was evenings that gave Avery's life its quiet meaning. Just as the sun began to dip behind the skyline, casting golden reflections across the windows of high-rise buildings, she would close the library, sling a canvas bag over her shoulder, and walk 2 blocks west of the little cafe she favored. It was a cozy spot named the Fennel Fig, owned by a kind couple who knew her routine by heart. Without needing to ask, they'd pack up a fresh meal, always warm, always comforting. A hearty stew in winter, a grilled veggie wrap in summer, and always with an extra cookie wrapped carefully in wax paper. Then Avery would make her way 3 blocks east, in the opposite direction of the after-work rush. She moved against the current, weaving past sleek cars and impatient walkers, ignoring the blaring ads on digital billboards. With every step, the city's noise faded. Concrete gave way to cobblestone. Neon lights surrendered to the soft glow of antique street lamps. Her destination, Merrow Park, a pocket of green tucked between towering apartment buildings, nearly forgotten by the city around it. At its heart stood a great weeping willow, its branches hanging like curtains, brushing the earth with gentle grace. And beneath that willow, always on the same bench, sat Eli. She didn't know where he came from or how long he'd been there. The first time she saw him, he was quietly feeding pigeons from a paper bag, a worn scarf tucked around his neck, and an old coat that looked like it had once been expensive. His beard was thick, his posture straight, and his gaze alert, watchful, as though listening to things no one else could hear. Unlike many others she'd met through volunteer work or during library charity events, Eli never begged. He never asked for anything. That was part of what drew her to him. There was a mystery in his silence. Not pride, but someone who had once belonged somewhere else, and now wandered the edges of that old life like a ghost unsure how to return. From the start, Avery made no assumptions. She didn't come with pity in her voice or a clipboard in her hands. She simply offered him food, a smile, and a place in her evening. At first, he accepted with a quiet nod, no more than polite thank you. But after a week or 2, he began to speak. Just short observations. The shape of the clouds, the smell of rain, the strange architecture of nearby buildings. Avery would respond, sometimes with humor, sometimes with curiosity, and often with stories of her own. Their 5-minute conversations grew longer with each passing day. They talked about books. Eli seemed to know classics and obscure titles alike. He'd quote authors with eerie precision, then follow with a joke dry enough to make her laugh. Sometimes they discussed the nature of time, of loneliness, of memory. Other times they simply sat in silence, letting the sounds of distant traffic and rustling leaves fill the space. Still, She never pried. She didn't ask about his past, or why he seemed to flinch when sirens rang out nearby, or why he stared into the distance like he was waiting for something, or someone. She didn't ask why he chose this park, this bench, this tree. She just came back. Night after night, meal after meal, story after story. And slowly, beneath the branches of that quiet willow, something unexpected began to grow. Not quite a friendship, not quite romance, but something else entirely. A connection, deep and quiet, like roots spreading unseen beneath the earth. As autumn deepened, the leaves of Merrow Park shifted from vibrant green to burnt orange and rust red. The conversations beneath the willow tree grew longer, deeper, more layered. Avery kept showing up, meal in hand, sometimes with a book tucked under her arm, other times just carry herself, quietly willing to listen. And Eli, once reserved and silent, began to open one word at a time. He never offered details easily. His words arrived like hesitant birds, perched for a moment, testing the air, and just as quickly gone. But when he spoke, Avery noticed something strange. There was a polish to his language, a sharpness to the way he formed thoughts. He could quote Marcus Aurelius in one breath and joke about early 2000s programming in the next. He knew the difference between Kafka the writer and Kafka the software. He once described the trajectory of a failing satellite and compared it to a person drifting out of their own orbit. These weren't things you picked up from street corners. She began to wonder, who was he really? But Avery never asked, not directly. She respected the invisible boundary that had formed between them, one that allowed trust to grow at its own pace. She knew what it meant to have parts of yourself too tender, to expose to the world. So she waited, she listened, and she returned again and again, even when the evenings grew colder and the park emptied faster. One evening, a storm rolled through Alderhaven, the kind that turned the sidewalk slick and sent umbrellas flipping inside out. The wind whipped around the tall buildings like a wild animal, and people clung to their coats, rushing home with heads low. But Avery came anyway. She arrived soaked to the edges despite her raincoat, hair damp, glasses fogged. She held a thermos of homemade lentil soup in one hand and an umbrella in the other. She wasn't even sure he'd be there. The park was nearly deserted. But as she neared the willow tree, she saw him, Eli, hunched on the bench, wrapped in his too thin coat, his hood pulled over his head, rain dripping from the brim. He looked up when she approached, and something shifted in his expression, something close to disbelief. "You came," he said softly. "Of course I did," Avery replied, unfolding the umbrella and settling beside him. She poured the soup into a small, reusable cup and handed it over, her fingers brushing his. They sat there, sheltered under the shared umbrella, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain on leaves. Eli sipped the soup slowly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then, with his eyes fixed on the distance and voice barely louder than the rain, he said, "You treat me like a person, not a project." Avery turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "I don't think people are projects," she said. "They're stories. Some just haven't been finished yet." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Some don't get finished at all." She tilted her head, searching his face. "You don't believe that." He didn't respond right away, but after a long silence, he began to speak, not in a rush, but in fragments, like puzzle pieces laid out carefully on the table, one at a time. He told her that he once lived a different kind of life, one with suits and deadlines, meetings and late-night flights. He hinted at a job that revolved around tech, something high-stakes, something fast. But it had all ended. He didn't say how or why, only that it was sudden. And when it was gone, so was everything else, his direction, his purpose, even his name. "I came here because I needed to forget," he murmured. "And now, I'm not sure what I'm remembering anymore." Avery didn't push. She just placed a gentle hand on his sleeve. "That's okay," she whispered. "Some stories take time to come back." That night, when she returned home, Avery found herself lying awake in bed, replaying everything he had said. His words echoed, circling in her thoughts. Who was Eli before he became a ghost in the city? And how much of him still remained beneath the weight of whatever he was trying to forget? She didn't know. But something deep inside her whispered, this was only the beginning. There had always been something about Eli that lingered with Avery long after she left the park. His voice, his words, the way he would sometimes pause mid-sentence, like he was choosing between who he was and who he had become. It wasn't just his knowledge or manner of speech. It was a contradiction he carried in his silence. The more she got to know him, the more it seemed like he wasn't just hiding from the world. He was hiding from himself. Still, she never asked. She respected his boundaries. She told herself that if he wanted her to know, he'd share when he was ready. But then he didn't show up. It was a Thursday evening, unusually warm for late November. The air smelled of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. Avery arrived with her usual meal, a container of roasted vegetable pasta and a slice of apple pie she'd made the night before. But when she reached the willow bench, it was empty. She waited for 20 minutes. Then 30. The food cooled in her hands. By the time the lamps flickered on and shadows stretched long across the park, a knot of worry had formed in her stomach. He had never missed a night. She came back the next day. And the next. Still nothing. Finally, on Sunday, he was there. Eli sat with his shoulders hunched forward, his hands clenched in his lap. A bruise darkened his cheek, and there was a shallow cut near his eyebrow. His coat looked torn, and there was dry blood on the cuff of his sleeve. Avery's heart clenched. She rushed over. Eli, what happened to you? He flinched slightly at her voice, but then gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. Just bad luck, he mumbled. Wrong place, wrong time. She sat beside him slowly, handing him the warm food she brought. He accepted it, but barely touched it. His eyes were different, distant and clouded, like someone trying to lock a door from the inside. Avery didn't push. Not that day. But her unease grew. That night, she called a friend, Maya, a former college roommate who now worked as an investigative reporter for a tech news site. Over tea, she described Eli, his speech, his references to obscure programming languages, his understanding of systems and infrastructure. I don't know, Maya, she said, stirring her tea absently. He talks like someone who used to run things. Big things. I keep thinking maybe he wasn't always on that bench. Maya raised an eyebrow. You think he was someone famous? Not famous, but important. Smart. Like he used to belong somewhere else, and he's just lost. Maya's curiosity was piqued. She asked for a rough description, scribbled a few notes, and promised to dig around. No promises, she said. But if he left a digital footprint, I might be able to find it. Avery almost regretted saying anything the moment Maya left. It felt like a betrayal, digging into someone's past without their consent. But something inside her was twisting, a quiet urgency telling her that Eli's story held more than he was letting on. 2 days later, Maya called. Her voice was tight with disbelief. Avery, I think your Eli is actually Caleb Thorne. Avery blinked. What? No, that's not possible. Listen, Maya continued. I found a missing persons report filed nearly a year ago. Caleb Thorne was a rising tech magnate. Founded a company called Stratology, AI systems, automation, cloud data security, worth hundreds of millions. He was engaged to a woman named Laura. There was a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. She died. He disappeared shortly after. Everyone assumed he broke down, couldn't face the world, and then he just vanished. Avery sat in stunned silence. Maya sent her a picture, a candid photo from a tech conference 2 years earlier. Avery stared at the man on the screen, clean-shaven, in a crisp gray blazer. But the eyes, they were the same. Haunted, brilliant, sad. Everything inside her shifted. The next evening, she returned to Merrow Park. Her steps felt heavier than usual. The food in her hands was the same, but her heart was a whirlwind of confusion. She spotted him on the bench, reading an old paperback she brought him weeks ago. He looked up, smiled faintly, but faltered when he saw her expression. She sat beside him in silence for a long moment. Then, voice trembling, she asked, Why didn't you tell me who you were? Eli's Caleb's. Face went still. He looked down, And for the first time, she saw not the weariness of a man running from hardship, but the grief of someone who had lost everything. "I didn't tell you," he said softly, "because I didn't know who I was not anymore. Caleb Thorne died with her. What was left wasn't worth saving." Avery's throat tightened. "That's not true." He turned to her then, eyes raw and open. It was easier to disappear. Easier to become someone else. No expectations, no legacy, no guilt. Just silence. And then you showed up with your kindness, your stories. You looked at me like I was a person, not a ghost. She reached for his hand. "You're not a ghost, Caleb. Or Eli. Or whatever name you choose. You're still here. And you matter." And in that moment, under the soft rustling of the willow's branches, something shifted between them. The truth was no longer hidden. The simplicity they once shared, those quiet evenings beneath the willow, the warmth of home-cooked meals and unspoken understanding, was fractured the moment the truth came to light. It didn't happen all at once. But once the mask of Eli had been peeled away, Caleb Thorne was no longer a secret kept between them. He was a headline. Avery noticed a shift almost immediately. The park, once a secluded sanctuary, slowly filled with unfamiliar eyes and hushed whispers. Cameras began to appear in the distance, hidden behind bushes or disguised as casual park-goers. Journalists who had dug up the story of a missing billionaire living as a homeless man now camped out in anticipation, hungry for a photo, a quote, a moment of confirmation. And still he came. Each evening, he arrived at the bench beneath the blooming willow, shoulders slightly more tense than the day before, wearing a hoodie pulled low and sunglasses he never used to need. But when he sat down beside Avery, some of that tension melted. He spoke softly, gently, about nothing, about everything. He never complained. He just existed with her. But Avery could feel the storm building behind him. The past Caleb had left behind was clawing its way forward. His former company, Thorne Stratology, reached out through a high-profile letter leaked to press. "Caleb, if you're reading this, the board wants you back. We're holding your seat. Come home." Lawyers arrived next, offering to help smooth the transition, to reclaim his identity, to reinstate the frozen assets, to re-enter the world that had moved on without him. Even old friends and distant family members he hadn't spoken to in years began sending messages, hopeful and greedy all at once. Avery watched all of this unfold like someone watching a tide swell, knowing there's no stopping the wave. He was being pulled in two directions, by the life he once had and by the life he had found. She tried not to let it change things between them, but it did. Their conversations turned heavier. He spoke of guilt more openly now, about how he had built his fortune on long hours and hard decisions, and how none of it had mattered when Laura, his fiancée, died. He admitted that for a long time, he hadn't wanted to live at all. Disappearing into the streets had been the only way he could survive. "I wasn't trying to punish anyone," he said once, his voice hollow. "I just couldn't breathe in that world anymore." Avery listened, and she stayed. But part of her wondered if she was holding on to a man who would inevitably be reclaimed by the life waiting on the other side of all this chaos. She questioned the man sitting beside her, the version she had known, fed, laughed with, would still exist once he returned to boardrooms and black cars. She never asked him to choose. She never wanted to be the reason someone turned their back on redemption or responsibility. But then he chose anyway. One morning in early spring, when the willow's branches were budding with delicate green and the park smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, Caleb arrived at the bench before her. He wasn't in disguise. No hoodie, no glasses, just himself, standing under the soft sunlight, eyes bright and unguarded. Avery approached cautiously, noticing the stillness in his posture, the way he held something in his hand. He knelt before the bench where they first met, where their story had unfolded like the pages of a forgotten book finally being read again. In his palm sat a simple silver ring, unpolished, unflashy, and yet somehow perfect. "I've lived two lives," he said, his voice firm but tender. "One chasing success, one hiding from sorrow. But neither felt real until I met you." She blinked back tears, the corners of her mouth trembling. "I lost myself in the noise of the world," he continued. "But in your kindness, I found my way back. Not to who I was, but to who I want to be, with you. Avery stared at him for a long breath, her heart pounding. You don't have to give it all up, she whispered. But I do, he replied, because none of it means anything without you in it. Silence stretched around them. Then, with a tearful smile, she took his hand and nodded. Yes. And in that moment, under the blooming willow where their two fractured lives had quietly mended, they stepped into something neither of them had expected. A future not built on wealth or sorrow, but on healing, on love, and on the quiet strength that had carried them through. They didn't want a spotlight. There were no articles in society magazines, no wedding photographers jostling for the perfect shot. Avery and Caleb chose a quiet ceremony under the very tree where their story had begun. No cathedral ceilings, no towering cakes. Just vows exchanged beneath the blooming branches of the willow in Merrow Park, with a few close friends, handwritten promises, and hearts fuller than ever before. In the months that followed, the world watched closely. Many expected Caleb Thorne to return to his empire, to resume his title as the brilliant mind behind Thorne Stratology, to step back into the boardroom with the same fire he'd once ruled with. But he didn't. Instead, he and Avery turned away from the roar of corporate life and toward the silent suffering they both now saw clearly. They created something entirely new. The Willow Foundation. Fueled by the fortune Caleb once amassed, and inspired by the compassion Avery had quietly practiced for years, they founded a grassroots movement aimed at helping the homeless not just survive, but heal and thrive. It wasn't charity. It was redemption, offering second chances to those written off by society. Their approach was personal, human, and deeply intentional. Each shelter they opened offered not just beds, but therapy, education, job training, and most importantly, dignity. Their very first center opened just 3 blocks from Merrow Park. The space was warm and filled with light, far from the sterile institutions many expected. The walls were painted in soft colors and adorned with hand-painted murals inspired by the children's stories Avery had once read aloud at her library. Tales of resilience, magic, and hope. There were reading nooks, community gardens, and laughter in the hallways. At the heart of the courtyard stood a young willow tree, carefully planted by Caleb himself. It served as a symbol, a reminder of beginnings, of the moment his life had turned toward healing under the watchful shade of another willow. They called their flagship program the Eli Project, named not for the billionaire, but for the man he had become on the streets, the man Avery had seen when no one else did, the version of himself that had once been lost, then saved by something as simple and as powerful as a warm meal and a conversation. Years passed. The media moved on. The tech world forgot about Caleb Thorne's mysterious disappearance and quiet reemergence. But in Alderhaven, his and Avery's legacy endured, not as a headline, but as a living, breathing presence in the lives they touched. People spoke not of the billions he left behind, but of the lives they helped rebuild, of the mother reunited with her children, of the veteran who now led art classes in the shelter, of the teenage girl who learned to code, mentored by Caleb himself, and went on to build a startup of her own. And always, they spoke of Avery, the woman who chose to walk slowly, who noticed what others ignored, and whose kindness changed the trajectory of not just one life, but hundreds. In Alderhaven, beneath the long arms of a weeping willow, strangers still gather. Meals are still shared. Names are still remembered. And every time someone reaches out with compassion, the ripple grows wider, stretching far beyond what Avery and Caleb ever dreamed. All because, one evening long ago, a woman brought soup to a man the world had forgotten, and chose to see him not for who he appeared to be, but for who he truly was. If the story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We bring you more stories like this. Stories that speak to the heart, remind us of what matters, and shine a light on the beauty hidden in ordinary moments. Subscribe now, and help us keep sharing stories that change the world, one soul, one smile, one act of kindness at a time.